All right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The War Room by yours truly, Sigma Jones, and my co host, Logic's Finest, who is in the background. First and foremost, just want to give a shout out to our subscribers for this series. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for tuning in. We truly appreciate the love and support. Hope you all are doing well on this lovely Saturday night or Sunday morning, depending on where you are at this time in the world. Um, Before we continue, definitely want to give a special shout out and thank you to SKC. He was the one that actually did the new intro that you may have seen at the beginning of this episode. Um, Definitely is some work that we did in progress, trying to get the intro set up and everything, and excuse me, the finishing product just came out phenomenal. Um, yeah, it was a work of art just seeing the final product and being able to share it with you all. So we definitely plan to take this series to new heights. We really want to make it more of a historical foundation on this channel as well as moving forward. So definitely be on the lookout for more information and things to come through for the War Room. Now, with that being said, let me bring up my co-host, Mr. Logic's Finest, aka Paul Bryant. How you doing today, sir? Logic Finest, are you there?
Hello?
Hey, are you with me today?
Hmm.
Okay, he might be having some issues with his mic going on, but we can wait until he come back. Um, so while we're waiting for him to come back, for those who are new to the series, this is definitely our way of looking into the historical aspects of World War II. Personally, I believe this is one of the most life changing events that could ever happen to mankind. Depending on good or bad is how you see to it and how, you may interpret it. But we're not here to look at the opinions. We're just here to look at the facts and see what goes from there. So I see my co-host is back. Let me bring him back in. How you doing, sir? Mr. Logic's Finest? Are you still with me? Okay, we might still be having some tech issues.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Okay. You hear me fine, but my audio hearing you was extremely choppy. Let me. Hmm.
Well, how about this? Let's if you stay put, I'm going to take myself out and come back in. See if that helps.
Okay.
All right. All right. How about now?
Oh, that sounds perfect.
Okay. All right. We are in business. How you doing today, sir?
you know, I'm good. I'm good. First off, I'm great. I hope you and your family are well. And it has been a most illuminating time. Um, as we've spoken off air on the back end, this time right now is an anthropologist's dream because I'm sitting back and I'm watching I'm watching social engineering happen in real time.
Mm-hmm.
You're never afforded that opportunity. Social engineering generally happens over a 5 to 10 to 15 to 20-year period. You're seeing in real time. So you're seeing the absolute polarization of entire populations. You're seeing the media create mindsets. Okay, you have um, quote unquote leaders. I use that term lightly. So entire frame, the public discourse frame has been completely set by media. So you're seeing how
Mm-hmm.
mindsets, which govern everything, have been completely shaped, and how everyone is discussing topics that have been literally handed to them. Now, where am I going with this? It harkens back to the same exact thing that we saw in the intra-war period between World War One and World War Two, and how several
Mm-hmm.
individuals rose to power controlling the masses. When I was in college, one of my professors told me something that has stuck with me to this very day. He who controls the dissemination of information controls the masses. And there's an old saying that we've all heard: those who, paraphrasing, because it's said 4 or 5 different times, but
Mm-hmm.
those who fail to learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And I'm
Yep.
seeing the same exact things that happened during World War II happen again. Population control, mass media control, mass mindset control, social engineering. This is absolutely an anthropologist's dream, this situation right now. Seeing how the longer this uncomfortable situations continue, how people act, and how you're seeing the global populations are shaped and molded. And the conversations that are had are meaningless because it's the underlying conversations that people just totally gloss over. So for me, this is an extremely instructive and interesting time.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mention about the whole dynamic that's going on right now as far as how information is being interpreted. Now, when people today talk about, getting the right information, fake news, fact checks and everything, they don't realize that this is not the first rodeo where certain informations have been misintrued or misinterpreted. Like you pointed out not too long ago, when you look at the era and time leading up to the events of World War II, you can actually say that that time frame was the birth of propaganda. And the leader we're going to be looking at tonight and today in regards to Winston Churchill, we're actually going to see some of his dealings because he actually was part of journalism and all. So he kind of had some insight into putting out information that may not have been interpreted the right way. I mean, for those who listened in on the previous episode, we talked about how this was a man who went to the Boer War and he was actually caught as a prisoner. And he he actually made dealings, which is considered treason in today's time. He made dealings is in regards of trying to set himself free. But when he escaped and he made it back to London, he painted himself this picture as if he was some war hero. And at the time, because he had the insights into journalism and the media, he can construe that story into whatever angle he wanted. And unfortunately, a lot of the masses took it hook, line, and center. And so One thing that I will guide many listeners that are listening in tonight, when you're looking at how information is being construed in today's climate, take a good look of how that sort of information was being construed back during the days of the 20s, 30s, and the 40s. And you will be surprised how very similar their methods and tactics that was used back then is still being used today.
You know, I couldn't have said it any better myself because we all know about Joseph Goebbels, who was the
Mm-hmm.
minister, Reichsminister of Propaganda. Now, in those days, propaganda was not a bad term. Every government used propaganda, and they used that term, propaganda. The United States military was a part of the War Department. It was not called the Department of Defense until 46 or 47. Someone may correct me on my times, right? But it was called the
Mm-hmm.
War Department. And propaganda was not a bad term. And you had serials, they were called serials, that were shown in theaters, in newsreels, because the television had not been invented yet. That was all propaganda. So nothing is new under the sun. At some point, some someone got together collectively after the war and said, you know what? It's almost as if people got together collectively and said, we have to paint a new picture for the world going forward. And part of doing so is we're just going to use new words and new terms and remove them from the general lexicon. And it makes me wonder if Orwell didn't get his term for his book 1984, the term newspeak, if he didn't get that from what he observed after the war. Because if memory serves correct, Orwell served in the British military during the war. Again, I could be wrong. I could be wrong about that, but it's amazing. It's really is amazing how when you really study history and you study the underpinnings versus what people talk about. If what I'm saying is, it's funny how people focus on what's right in front of their face, but they
Mm-hmm.
miss the truth that's hidden underneath, and it's so thinly veiled. It's thinly veiled, but people fall for it, hook, line, and sinker.
Absolutely. And I find it very interesting, even in today's time. And it really shows you the power of mass media, where you will have individuals who will only listen to one particular news company or broadcast. And no matter what that particular media says or do, a lot of folks take whatever they say at face value. Even though you can go to other sources that will share similar stories or may share a more contradictory insight, but because people have this sort of loyalty to certain broadcasters and certain media companies, even if you present them other factual evidence that would cause any logical person to at least reevaluate their point of view, and even evaluate the other person's point of view and see what is the truth that majority of the time is going to be somewhere in the middle. But
Mm-hmm.
instead, they will only follow that particular broadcaster or media team to the fullest. No other information is relevant. And to me, that is pretty scary how truly powerful the media can have on the mass population. And once
Well,
again, it's not this is something that's not new, because when we're doing this deep dive into the preludes of World War II, you're really going to see how the things that were going on back then is very, very similar to what's going on now.
well, it's funny. People people aren't interested in the news. They're interested in comfortable stories. So, as
Hmm.
you said, people watch personalities. It doesn't even matter what he or she is saying. Do the masses like that person? Do they feel that person is trustworthy? When you look at elections, no one no one discusses track record. No one discusses policy. No one discusses theory. No one talks about what makes up statecraft. It's a popularity contest. How much do you like this guy? How much do you dislike this guy? What talking points or bullet points can this person hit versus that person hit? It's a popularity contest. So the last time that I checked, um, scripted television shows win Emmy Awards. So why do news programs also win Emmy Awards? Are they putting it in your face, telling you that everything that you're seeing is in fact fake? Everything. It's
Mm.
all false. And they put it right in front of your face, and yet you still can't see the forest for the trees. So at that point, you've been so programmed, you're fooling yourself. But that's another conversation for another day.
Absolutely. But it actually ties into the person we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, like I mentioned before on the previous episode, even though it talked a little bit more about Winston's father, as far as his attitudes and things that he done in politics and everything, we were already given a brief idea of the type of lifestyle Winston was growing up and being involved into. And last we left off, he was pretty much getting into his more journalism aspect and being a journalist and paying himself as a war hero, even though it definitely is some questionable actions that he done that would be considered highly unacceptable in any military type of confrontation. But the mere fact that he works within the media kind of highlights his ability to change the perception of the people around him. And last we left off, he's starting to more and more get involved into politics. And right, this is where we're left off, where we now get into the 1900 general elections. And this here, when you read up about how this particular election came about, I have to say, for those who are watching today's climate, you'll be very surprised to see some correlations between what happened back then and what's happening now. And so that's why I love history, because to me, if you want to understand what's going on today, all you have to do is look into the history books to get an idea what happened then and what's the ripple effects that is continuing on to this day.
Yep, there you go. There you go. If you don't learn the lessons of the past, you are doomed to repeat them. And people don't learn because the same things, they repeat themselves over and over and over again. And those who are in positions of power, they know this, they understand this, and that is how they maintain control. That's exactly how they maintain control.
Absolutely. Well, let's get right into it and see how a person who actually is from the elite class, how they go about doing their things that will have ripple effects on the masses. And this is where we look into some of the things that Winston Churchill do to get involved into politics. So let's jump right into it. So this is the 1900 general election. It says in June of 1900, Churchill returned to Britain as, quote, a famous figure in every British household with access to a newspaper. He went on a lecture tour of England and the United States, amassing the tremendous sum of, at the time, £10,000. He also wrote about his experiences in the book London to Ladysmith, 1900. A member of the Conservative Party, he was selected as the prospective parliamentary candidate of Oldham. On the 25th of July, a motion on the Boer War caused a three-way split in the Liberal Party. A total of 40 liberal imperialists that included Herbert Asquith, Edward Grey, Richard Haldane, and Archibald Primrose, Lord Rosebery, supported the government's policy in South Africa. Henry Campbell Bannerman and the 34 others abstained, whereas 31 liberals, led by David Lloyd George, voted against the motion. Robert Cecil, the Marquis of Salisbury, decided to take advantage of the divided Liberal Party, and on the 25th of September, 1900, he dissolved Parliament and called a general election. Lloyd George admitted in one speech he was in a minority, but it was his duty as member of the House of Commons to give his constituents honest advice. He went on to make an attack on Tory jingoism. Quote, "The man who tries to make the flag an object of a single party is a greater traitor to that flag than the man who fires upon it." Now, that last sentence, I tell you, it's just so funny. So that last sentence where he says, "The man who tries to make the flag an object of a single party is a greater traitor to that flag than the man who fires upon it." Funny how history just hits you straight in the face when it comes down to it repeating itself.
Over and over and over again. Because the funny thing is, sticking with Winston Churchill, in militaries, if you provide aid and comfort to the enemy, that is called treason. You can be imprisoned or worse. And when I say worse, I think we mean the ultimate worse. Also, if you provide, if you seek aid and comfort from the enemy while you are imprisoned, that is considered treason. You have a duty to fight and resist with every fiber of your being. But when you actively seek aid and comfort from the enemy, that is treason. So what does that make Winston Churchill with what he did? He's literally sought aid and comfort from the enemy while he was a prisoner. Now, as he says, to quote, "The man who tries to make the flag an object of a single party is a greater traitor to that flag than the man who fires upon it." You know, it's funny how times change, but if you understand what he was trying to make reference to in that statement, and then you apply it to current times, you'll see how we're already far beyond the pale. We're past the point where there's no going back. Masses are totally controlled. Everything you see from media, everything you see from government, it's fake. Every country. It's all about population control. And how do you control the masses? You control mindsets. If you don't enslave the populace, then you control their minds. Now, that statement says a lot. Unfortunately, personally, I am of the opinion, based on objective observation, we are past the point of no return. Every government on this planet controls its population through various means, others to varying extents. Some are worse than others. In my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
America is actually one of the worst, but every government controls their population. I will leave that there.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. And it's interesting because, like you said, countries have means and methods of how they go about controlling the masses. Some do it by virtue of culture, something that they've have established for many years and centuries at that. And then you have those who control the masses based off of what I would term illusions. And some can have their opinions and everything as far as some of the tactics that countries use to control the masses. But what I find probably the most offensive, but yet the most effective, is when you're able to control the masses through illusion. And when I was looking at that particular sentence where it says, the man who tries to make the flag an object of a single party is a greater traitor to that flag than the man who fires upon it. To me, that's an example of giving the sense of an illusion. A man, so to speak, who objectifies something, whatever that may be, is somehow more of a traitor to that object or person or group than, so to speak, the man who fires upon it. Now, on the outside, it may seem logical, but this is where, for those who get caught up in the world of politics, what may seem okay from the surface level is some deep underlyings going on underneath.
Exactly. It's all smoke and mirrors, and that's the thing about politics. It's all smoke and mirrors, and it plays into people's need to be told comfortable things. People don't people don't want to actually hear the truth. They don't. They
Yep.
want to hear the sweet lies. They want to hear everything is okay. Someone is going to pat them on their head and tell them, lay down, relax. I'll do all the thinking for you. I got this. Everything is fine. That's what people want. They don't want the truth. They tell you they want the truth, but they want their version, or they want a comfortable version, or only as much truth as they can stand or tolerate. Politicians know this, and it's all about an image. It's all about the right public persona, the image, the smokescreen, the lies, the illusion. That's what it's all about. It's all about the illusion. Statecraft and politics are two separate things. And politicians know this. They understand this. But, and that's why you have the situations that you have around the world. So every politician, everything you see publicly is a calculated move. So when you have a person who has a proven history and track record of a certain line of thinking, then they step on a certain stage and they do a complete 180. That is public image. That is smokescreen. Do not believe that. When a person tells you who they are, believe them. Except for when they stand on the political stage, because every word that comes out of their mouth is a lie. But I digress.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you are definitely right about that. All right. So the next paragraph says this. Says Henry Campbell Bannerman, with a difficult task of holding together the strongly divided Liberal Party, and they were unsurprisingly defeated in the 1900 general election. The Conservative Party won 402 seats against the 183 achieved by the Liberal Party. However, anti-war MPs did better than those who defended the war. David Lloyd George increased the size of his majority in their Carnarvon Borrow, excuse me. Other anti-war MPs, such as Henry Labarque and John Burns, both increased their majorities. In Wales, of 10 Liberal candidates hostile to the war, 9 were returned, while in Scotland, every major critic was victorious. Churchill became the Tory MP for Oldham, a largely working class area. He was part of a highly undemocratic political system where the majority of adults who could not vote in elections, all women were denied the franchise, and about 40% of men were excluded, and many others had more than one vote through additional business votes. Churchill defended the system on the grounds that it made, quote, government dignified and easy, and the intercourse with foreign states more cordial. And in an act of self-denial, wrote, quote, Parliament was elected on a democratic franchise.
That sounds a lot like the American Electoral College to me.
That I would say the same thing. Like, wow.
Again, the truth is right in front of your face. It's thinly veiled. You're looking at it, and yet you can't see it. It's like there's stories of when the Native Americans saw the first trains, they couldn't see it. They said, "Oh, it's an iron horse." They were looking right at it and couldn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
Your vote literally does not count. People call me crazy for saying that. You have an electoral college. You do not vote your president. The electoral college does. 1, check your history. I was taught that in school. The popular vote does not elect presidents. The electoral college elects the president. They elect the president. They're called electors. Number 2, 4 years ago, you had a candidate who got 3 million more total votes than the other candidate, yet that candidate lost. Period. End of discussion. What more do you need to see to prove to you how you have a system right in front of your face? It's a smokescreen. It's a lie. You do not elect your president, literally. But if enough people believe a lie, that lie becomes truthful. It's still a lie, but it has the power of truth.
Yeah, and even in that particular paragraph, you could just see how it's a disadvantage in that voting process. First off, women couldn't vote. It says right there, plain and simple. And then 40% of the men within his particular area for Churchill, they were excluded from being able to vote. Now, for whatever reasons, you would have to do a deeper dive to see why. But then in that same sentence, it says many others had more than one vote through additional business votes. Now, can you just imagine? Say if you're a businessman and you own, say, 10 business within the area, and according to their system at the time, you get 1 vote per business. You talk about the power that be in regards to electing who into office. Like you rightly pointed out, my friend, the votes today, the whole lie is to make you believe that your vote counts. Back then, looking at this information, clearly your votes didn't count.
It reminds me of the serf system where you had a lord. A lord owned his lands, and any person who lived on his lands was basically his subject. You were beholden to that lord because you were on his land. It's the same thing. So that lord may or may not have been a member of the nobility. No, I'm sorry. He was a member of the nobility. He may or may not have been a member of the royal court, but he was a member of the nobility in that he had wealth, he owned lands, and he had people who lived on his lands and worked his lands. And it was all at the pleasure of that lord. For those who don't know, that's where the term landlord comes from, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. And you're seeing this you're seeing this as recently as the 1900s. The truth is always in population control mindsets. If you present people with something, they focus on it and they talk about it as if it is the end all be all. It's totally fake, but they're so focused on it that they can't see the truth that's right in front of their eyes.
Yep. And before we move on to the next session, I just want to point this out to the audience too. So when it says in that paragraph that many others had more than one vote through additional business votes, you want to know what's a modern day equivalent to that particular additional business votes? Corporate lobbyists. And I'll leave it there.
Okay. Because
Please continue. Yeah, please continue. Please continue.
I was going to stop you, but you stopped. Brilliantly said. So, someone in the chat says that electoral college seems to act as a buffer or a backstop of sorts between the elites and the masses to ensure that high-level interests are well secured. Well, see, here's the thing. Here's what I was taught in school. The electoral college was created by quote-unquote founders and framers, the terms that we use, to quote-unquote ensure the masses never make the wrong choice for president.
Mm-hmm.
So, literally, the system was put in place and designed that the general public does not directly elect a president. The Electoral College, quote-unquote, ensures the masses will not make the wrong choice for president, unquote. That is why the system was created and put in place and functions to this very day. Now, who would you think, based on what the two of us have been saying, would be these framers? If you're a little light on your American history, they were all men of wealth and power.
Mm-hmm.
Because political power comes from one thing and one thing only, M-O-N-E-Y. And if you look throughout history, historically speaking, governments, whatever the form, from monarchy on down, the men who make the decisions are the men who have the wealth in that nation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely. Well, the next paragraph says this. Churchill later recalled that he had hoped to enter the House of Commons to join forces with his father, but his death destroyed that ambition. Quote, all my dreams of comradeship with him, of entering Parliament at his side and in his support, were ended. There remained for me only to pursue his aims and vindicate his memory. He admitted he had gone into politics to vindicate Lord Randolph's reputation and to, quote, raise the tattered flag from the stricken battlefield which his father had let fall. Churchill gave the impression he was very ambitious, and people who met him tended to be very critical of his personality. He came, quote, across as overbearing, wearing people down by his refusal to stop talking about himself or politics, his two real interests in life. Churchill did not seem interested in other people or what they thought, and therefore found it difficult to make close personal relationships. The veteran politician, Sir Charles Whitworth Dilke, described him as, quote, about the most ambitious man I had ever met. Henry Cabot Lodge, the American diplomat, wrote to President Theodore Roosevelt about Churchill, saying, quote, "I've met him several times. He is undoubtedly clever, but conceited to a degree which it is hard to express either in words or figures." So, I find it interesting that we've already talked about the early years of Adolf Hitler and the early years of Joseph Stalin. And we already know a little bit of their background as far as the hardships they come up with. Meanwhile, you have Winston Churchill, a guy who you could say is literally born with a spoon in his mouth. And now he wants to follow in the footsteps of his father, get into politics. And already he exemplifies the sort of type of behavior that is pretty common amongst the average politician.
Once again, good sir, you take the words right out of my mouth, because the qualities attributed to him by others who met him professionally, those are the qualities of a politician. They are not the qualities of a person who is well versed in statecraft. As we have covered, politics and statecraft are actually two very different things. So for him, a very ambitious, conceited person, all about public image, painting that smoke screen, that's all political BS. That's not the kind of person you want as a leader. But as we all know this,
Oh yeah, I could definitely sense where you're going, because to me, and this is why, as the old saying goes, history is conveyed by the victors. And so Winston Churchill, as he would later on become on the victorious side of World War II, he will be able to control his image a little bit. And really, even if you look at a lot of politicians that will go on to win their respective elections and all, they're able to have control over what sort of image is painted about them. And usually that comes in the price of MONEY. The more of that you have, the better control you have over your image.
There you go. Money makes the world go around. Anyone who thinks any different is either naive or they're fooling themselves. Or they're lying to you. Money makes the world go around. And it is interesting how politics is replete with examples of individuals who were born with silver spoons in their mouths, who then enter political life trying to appeal to the quote-unquote common working man. And people repeatedly fall for that same BS over and over and over again. That's why I've said 1,000 times, I'm surrounded by a planet full of morons, but I digress.
I feel your pain. Now, the next paragraph says, Robert Lloyd George actually found him more appealing. Quote, Churchill was unexpectedly short in stature, about 5'6" tall. He had a pugnacious expression, pale blue eyes, and, as a young man, red hair. His head jutted forward in eagerness to enter into debate or battle. His oratory was of a completely different kind to that of Lloyd George. It consisted of sonorous, rhetorical, rolling around oraton phrases learned from his readings of Macaulay and Gibbon, and painstakingly prepared and rehearsed until he knew his speeches by heart. Patrice Webb was also underwhelmed when she met him for the first time. Quote, first impression, restless, almost intolerably so, without capacity for sustained and unexciting labor. Egotistical, bumptious, shallow-minded, and reactionary, but with a certain personal magnetism, great pluck, and some originality. Not of intellect, but of character. More of the American speculator than the English aristocrat. We're going to come back to that later.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of people we know, but I digress.
Like I said, we're definitely going to come back to that. Talked exclusively about himself and his electioneering plans. But I dare say he has a better side, which the ordinary cheap cynicism of his position and career covers up to a casual dinner acquaintance. Bound to be unpopular, too unpleasant a flavor with his restless, self-regarding personality and lack of moral or intellectual refinement. His bugbears are labor, NUT, and expenditure on elementary education or on the social services. Defines the higher education as the opportunity for the, quote, brainy man to come to the top. No notion of scientific research, philosophy, literature, or art. Still less of religion. But his pluck, courage, resourcefulness, and great tradition may carry him far unless he knock himself to pieces like his father. Now, reading all of that detail right there from Patrice Webb, obviously, a lot of those traits you could just pinpoint and say, yep, a lot of politicians have this trait, have that trait and all. But what really caught my attention is the fact that she said his personality was more of the American speculator than that of an English aristocrat. That says a lot.
You know, I saw that, and one of the things that stands out to me, no notion of scientific research, philosophy, literature, or art, still less of religion. But his pluck, courage, resourcefulness, and great tradition may carry him far unless he knocks himself to pieces like his father. So, when you lack the requisite resources, intelligence, experience, expertise, or knowledge, or ability, you have to make up for it through sheer charisma and personal magnetism. AKA fake it till you make it. Have a good mouthpiece to make up for the lack of actually having what is required or having anything substantial, which a certain demographic calls a certain word that starts with a G and ends with an E, but I digress. So the point here is a lot of politicians are like that. And again, I said it before and I'll say it again. There was a difference between politics and statecraft. He was a brilliant politician at running popularity contests and whipping up the rabble and getting people to follow certain things. But that does not necessarily translate into a person who's good at statecraft, especially someone who exhibits these traits. He was born, basically, this man was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but he was neither intelligent nor was he possessing of great character or morals or a code or standards. That's who Winston Churchill was. So you're starting
Yep.
to see again why I said in our last episode, I have studied this man thoroughly. And what is regarded to him, to history, being written by the victors, it's lies. He was a POS. But I digress.
No, that's definitely spot on. And to me, I want the audience to kind of think of something. Can you honestly think of a politician, especially those who are from America and listening in? Can you honestly think of a politician who is a true expertise when it comes down to scientific research, philosophy, literature, and the arts? I can tell you right now, even one of the former presidents that a certain demographic really puts on a pedestal as if, he just have magical gold dust and whatnot. And don't get me wrong, all the former presidents, even from the 90s and up, there was nothing special about them. A lot of them, I'll put it like this: the elevator for most of them don't go all the way up to the top. But a one particular president, I know for a fact, sure, he went to law school and all, but when it came down to scientific research, when it came down to even philosophy, not that bright of a person.
You know, not for nothing, but Baby Bush was dumber than a bag of rocks.
Oh, yes. Oh,
And
yes.
yet, he was dumber than a bag of rocks. What does that say about the United States of America? That you had a president dumber than a bag of rocks. And yet, the criticisms, again, not even going to talk about any merits, but the criticisms of one Barack Hussein Obama was that, oh, he's too much like he's too much like your college professor. He's too studious. He's too well spoken. He's too intelligent. He's too this. He's too that. Oh, so you don't like someone who makes you feel that you're not very smart. Interesting. Leaving out Barack Hussein Obama, someone who makes you confront the reality that you are not that intelligent or not smart makes you feel uncomfortable. Let that sink in. That is the takeaway that I'm driving at with what I just said.
Oh, yeah. And I
These men
couldn't
are
agree more.
these men are a reflection of the populace. I'm only going to touch this very briefly. Forget everything that was put into the media. I said this in 2016. Donald J. Trump was a reflection of the United States of America. It's not a fluke. It's nothing you have to think about or worry about. That's a reflection of the populace of the United States of America. That's all I'll say on that. At
No,
this
you
particular
are.
juncture, we will circle back around to him later.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Believe me, we definitely got a segment of America coming up, especially the leader who represented them during these times. And trust me, we're really going to dissect some of the politics, and I put that in quotes, the American politics that went on back then. But yeah, I'm with you in regards to the people who have been elected into these higher positions is a reflection of the people who voted them in. No matter what side you on, you voted them in. But I digress. All right. So finish up this section. It says Winston Churchill made few speeches in the House of Commons. He preferred to give lectures where he was paid large sums of money. Hint, hint. In 1901, he earned at the time £690 for 14 lectures. When he did speak in Parliament, it was usually to attack the government on its spending proposals. It was based on the idea that was employed by his father when he first entered Parliament. It was believed that if a backbencher made life difficult on certain selected issues, they would attract attention and encourage the offer of a ministerial post to ensure their silence. Churchill developed a surprising close friendship with David Lloyd George, one of the most left-wing members of the Liberal Party. Lloyd George told his constituents in 1902, quote, "Last week there was a very interesting speech by a brilliant young Tory member, Mr. Winston Churchill. There is no greater admirer of his talent, I assure you, than the individual now addressing you. And many a chat we have had about the situation. We do not always agree, but we do not black each other's eyes." I think I will summarize that particular paragraph with the old adage, politics make strange bedfellows.
For those who actually understand how things work and not the fairy tale smokescreen. As certain demographics do, but I digress.
Absolutely. All right. So the next section, which actually be the last part of this particular article, talks about free trade. So it says on the 11th of July, 1902, Arthur Balfour replaced Earl of Rosebery as Prime Minister. Churchill was disappointed when he was not offered a job in the government. Churchill now wrote that what was needed was a government of the middle, the party which shall be free at once from the sordid selfishness and callousness of Toryism on the one hand and the blind appetites of the radical masses on the other. Wow. Let me read that last paragraph one more again. Churchill wrote that there needs to be a government of the middle, a party which will be free at once from the sordid selfishness and callousness of Toryism on one hand and the blind appetites of the radical masses on the other. People, do I need to give a beacon of how this correlates to today's climate?
Well, as a certain someone says, people need a political re-education. It is heavy lifting that you will not receive any thanks for. So I'm just going to leave that right there.
Yep, I'm going to leave that there too. Sometimes giving out too information could actually backfire. All right. So the next section says, in that year's budget, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think I said it right.
Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's Britain's version of the Secretary of the Treasury.
Okay. Hey, just learned something new. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, imposed what he called a small, quote, registration duty on imported wheat in order to provide extra money to finance war expenditure. Churchill spoke in favor in Parliament, voted for it, and defended it in public to his constituents, arguing that a tax on food was justified because, quote, it is the most convenient method of raising the money, and because unless the whole community bear a share in the burden of taxation, what check is there upon expenditure?
That is a brilliant statement. And once again, as I said at the very, very top, it is my opinion based upon objective observation. The world is already past the tipping point. So a statement like this, unfortunately, no longer holds weight because the wealthy elite control everything. So we are way beyond that point.
Yep, and I couldn't agree more on that. Next, it says on the 15th of May, 1903, Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary, exploded a political bombshell with a speech in Birmingham advocating a system of preferential colonial tariffs. Herbert Asquith was convinced that Chamberlain had made a serious political mistake, and after reading a report of the speech in the Times, he told his wife, quote, "Wonderful news today, and it is only a question of time when we shall sweep the country." It has been claimed that Chamberlain was undermining the leadership of Arthur Balfour. Quote, "A prime minister who has not won his own position is always vulnerable, and when the most powerful figure in the Conservative and Unionist alliance choose to challenge one of the fundamental dogmas of British politics, that vulnerability." Now, I find that interesting, that particular last quote. A prime minister who has not won his own position is always vulnerable. That says a lot in regards to. Definitely, there's difference as far as how politics goes in other countries, and especially when looking at Great Britain, because you have to understand with Great Britain, they have a mixture of their own parliament and then there's the monarchy. But when he said this quote, "A prime minister who has not won his own position is always vulnerable," it kind of shows that. Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, England has England has a parliamentary system. So in England, they don't actually vote for prime minister. They vote party. So in your local area, your local representative for parliament, they could be a Tory, which is a conservative, or they could be Labour, or they could be Social Democrat, or any of the other parties. So if you vote for your candidate, you are a Labour supporter, you're going to vote Labour. Or if you're a Tory or a Conservative supporter, you're going to vote your local representative. He's going to be Conservative. Now, around the country, if there are more Conservative members voted in than, say, Labour, then the Conservative Party automatically becomes the party that runs the government. The sitting leader of that party automatically becomes prime minister. For example, England just had an election last year. The Conservatives won. Had the Labour Party won, Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of the Labour Party, automatically would have become Britain's prime minister. Not that he was running for it, but that his party in general was running to control the government. So that's a major difference between the parliamentary system that countries like Britain have and whatever cluster F it is that America has.
Indeed. So, with that said, then, take into account that you only become prime minister if your party actually wins the majority. Then, what it sounds like with this quote, "A prime minister who has not won his own position is always vulnerable," it seems to me then that there will be situations where the leader of a particular party may not have been so well liked within his own party.
Exactly.
And even though that party will go on to take the majority of parliament and become the leadership, he could be undermined by his own party based on the fact that he didn't have the backing of the people within that party.
Especially if, for example, that leader just prior to the election, excuse me, let's say that the leader of that party received a vote of no confidence. So now someone else, it becomes the leader of the party. Or let's say the leader stepped down, or let's say that there was, as you said, he wasn't well liked, or for whatever reason, and he's out. So now there's someone else who may not necessarily have the full support of the party, but they're just there. So they're the leader of the party. Now, an election gets held. Party wins the majority of the seats in parliament. That leader now automatically becomes the prime minister. But he did not enjoy the full support of his party going in. So he is vulnerable to anyone who wants to assume leadership. Now, if you assume leadership, unless the prime minister steps down, you can't become prime minister. But if there is internal strife within his party, he's going to have a whale of a time getting anything passed through votes.
That is definitely interesting. And even then, it shows that there is definitely more balance in that type of system, like you said, compared to the American political system, where, yeah, it's definitely a lot more sense of balance in regards of, they say checks and balances, but this shows a lot more checks and balances compared to what the American version have.
Yeah, the American version is an absolute joke, because if you really think about it, and I used to pose this when I was in school, it's called checks and balances. But the way that I see it, correct me if I'm wrong, the president cannot sign anything into law. He
Nope.
needs Congress to pass it in both the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the president. And even if he signs it, it goes back to Congress for ratification. So even when you see on the news the president just signed into law, that's more smokescreen. It goes back to Congress for ratification. There has to be a ratification vote. So there's some. Then, of course, we have the Supreme Court. Any ruling that the Supreme Court makes becomes literally the law of the land. And only the Supreme Court can review or revisit a Supreme Court decision. So where am I going with this? It would seem to me that in your system of quote-unquote checks and balances, the executive branch actually is the least powerful of the three. President cannot declare war. There's something called the War Powers Act. There are many things that the president cannot do. And let's say the president wants to pass a law. It has to go through Congress. And if anything that he signs, if Congress doesn't ratify it, guess what? Nothing happens. Most recent example, besides President Trump and his travel bans, one Barack Hussein Obama in his attempt to normalize trade relations with Cuba. Somebody smartly put a lot of the trade issues into laws. So that would meant that President Obama would had to have proposed bills to Congress to have laws changed. So again, it's called checks and balances, but it would seem to me it's heavily weighted towards the judicial and the legislative. The White House, to me, seems to be the weakest of the three, and not on their level.
Yes, but this is where the power of illusion comes in, because if you listen to the media, especially these past few months, the soon-to-be former president was considered a tyrant, and how he pretty much was just one finger away from unleashing another war. But people, unfortunately, take that as face value, and they don't look at a system of, well, wait a minute. He doesn't have that particular power to do that. But again, power of illusion without fail.
Yeah, and then there's also I saw an email through a group email of a certain platform, which will remain nameless, that I'm still part of the email chain, and someone made reference to the fact that I'm paraphrasing. Um, the military doesn't have so and so president's back. This was a shot. This was a shot across the bow, a warning to him. And I'm thinking to myself, have you not been paying attention? Since 2017, generals were coming out and basically saying that certain orders president would give, they would just either not obey it or they'd steer the conversation a different way. They were not going to allow certain things to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's all about media perception. And people will argue you to death on points based around media perception, not actual truth and fact. And that I find comical, but I digress.
Oh no, sir. Spot on. Spot on. All right. So the next paragraph says Churchill made his opposition to tariff reform clear in a letter to Balfour and said that if he disavowed Chamberlain, he, quote, would command my absolute loyalty, but warned that if tariff reform became party policy, quote, I must reconsider my position in politics. In a speech in the House of Commons, he argued, quote, the idea of giving a preference to the colonies in matters which we must in any case tax for revenue has now been extended to a definite proposal for the taxation of foodstuffs, and although it is perfectly clear that this proposal of protective duties on food will please agriculturalists, or at any rate will please the bulk of them, what about the working man? On the 1st of July, 1903, Churchill was one of 53 conservative MPs who established a free food league. However, they were outnumbered by those supporting tariff reform. Churchill was aware that his Oldham constituency was strongly pro-free trade, and he began to consider the possibility of leaving the Conservative Party. He wrote to Hugh Cecil, quote, I am an English liberal. I hate the Tory party, their men, their words, and their methods. I feel no sort of sympathy with them. He added that he considered the Liberal Party as the best refuge, quote, against the twin assaults of capital and labor.
I find that so full of BS because
Yes.
after the war, when England had to rebuild itself, especially after the Battle of Britain, and England had to rebuild itself and didn't have the money, England could no longer maintain its colonies. That's why you started to see former British colonies gain their independence. The jewel, the crown jewel in the British crown was India. And what did Churchill do as a FU that he had to give up the crown jewel of England? He split the country right down the middle and told the Buddhists, here, this is India. Told the Muslims, here, this land is yours. We are going to call it Pakistan. You guys have at it. You hate each other and you kill each other, but you know what? We're gone. We're not going to take your land and give it to them. Call it Pakistan. You guys have at it. He is so full of it. Full of it.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. Just reading that last sentence, saying how he considered the Liberal Party as the best refuge against the twin assaults of capital and labor, it's like, what? later on, you could care less about capital and labor. And like you rightfully pointed out, how he broke up India, which was the crown jewel of the United Kingdom, is so much contradictory just in that particular paragraph. It's like this shows you, for all the audience that's listening in, this clearly shows you the power of one being able to control their image through money and resources. Because you read this and then you look at Churchill's actions before, during, and even after the war, the man is talking out of one mouth going into another.
He's absolutely full of it because, like every British politician, they absolutely knew what the situation was. England was a spider in the middle of the web, and the web was made up of the colonies. It was basically like the mafia. Everybody had to kick upstairs to the boss. It was the same exact thing. So for Churchill to even make that statement, he is so full of it.
Yep, indeed. Let's continue on and see what else he got coming out of his rear end. Says next, Churchill predicted that, quote, tariff reform or protection will result in a landslide victory for the Liberals at the next election. It would be such a disaster that, quote, the old Conservative Party would disappear and be replaced by a new party that would be rich, materialist, and secular. In a letter to Lord Northcliffe, he complained of, quote, the smug contentment of self-satisfaction of the government, neither protectionist nor pro-Boer, which will deal with the shocking administrative inefficiency which prevails. Next it says, Churchill became convinced that the Liberal Party would win Oldham at the next general election because of the town's views on free trade. Churchill had several meetings with senior Liberal figures. Churchill told Lord Hugh Cecil that David Lloyd George, quote, spoke to me at length about a positive program. He said, unless we have something to promise as against Mr. Chamberlain's promises, where are we with the working men? He wants to promise three things, which are arranged to deal with three different classes, namely, fixity of tenure to tenant farmers, subject to payment of rent and good husbandry, taxation of site values to reduce the rates in the towns, and, of course, something in the nature of Shackletown's Trades Disputes Bill for the trade unionists. So once again, we see the battle of classes and how politicians love to play on the emotions of classism.
Well, the elites practice classism. It's the masses who practice racism. But I digress. So it's funny how all these things. It's funny how Churchill is saying all of these things, yet he was relentlessly oppressive with his dealing towards India. And then he literally split the country in half and created Pakistan and basically created a civil war and hatred and unrest that persists to this day between those two countries, which was literally one country. And his overhanded and oppressive nature and ruling with an iron fist over the what are now the former British colonies. His duplicitous nature as a politician. I laugh. Like seriously, like guy, who are you saying this to? Clearly, the masses, not to someone who can actually think clearly and rationally, because they see through his BS.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, like as you pointed out, rightfully so. Unfortunately, people don't like it when there's a person in power that is smarter than them. They want somebody who they feel is on their same level. And so to me, that's where looking at Winston Churchill up at this point, it is just kind of like, yes, this man is saying all the right words. But if you follow the money and you follow what that money leads to, you will see Churchill is no different than any modern politician you have ever seen or heard of.
They're all the same because left wing, right wing, it's all the same bird. They're
Mm-hmm.
all the same. People lie to themselves because it makes them feel comfortable rather than face the hard truths that you have no say in your government at the highest levels, and that your own government will literally kill you to maintain power. People
Mm-hmm.
people will kill you before they accept and admit those truths.
Yep, absolutely. Next it says Churchill also had a meeting with Herbert Gladstone, the son of William Gladstone, and the Liberal Party chief whip, about the possibility of switching parties. It was agreed that on the 14th of February 1904, he would vote with the Liberals on a free trade motion in the House of Commons. However, it was not until the 29th of March that same year that he told Parliament that he intended on joining the Liberals. In protest, all the Conservative Party MPs walked out of the chamber. Interesting. Very interesting. Next it said,
They
oh,
they still do that now
oh
sometimes.
yeah.
But I digress.
I find it funny how these politicians, it is really is like watching theater. If you ever watch these politicians as far as with their meetings and all, you're literally watching a theater in play. So when you hear about these politicians, so to speak, walking out on meetings, or these politicians ripping up papers and whatnot, all of this is just classic theatrical. It's just classic ways of, so to speak, causing emotions. And especially when the camera is on, they want people to see the full effects of what they want to portray. To me, it's no different than the dramas that a lot of these females like to watch on a daily basis. It's all theatrical.
That's exactly what it is. It's all theatrics. These people don't hate each other. They live together. They work together. You think what? They're on opposite sides? No. You are supposed to believe that. It's all a game. It's all a game.
Again, like the old saying, politics makes strange
Strange
bedfellows,
bedfellows.
and not many people truly understand that. All right. Next it says Randolph S. Churchill, the author of Winston Churchill, pointed out, quote, he, Churchill, entered the chamber of the House of Commons, stood for a moment at the bar, looked briefly at both the government and opposition benches, and strolled swiftly up the aisle. He bowed to the speaker and turned sharply to his right to the Liberal benches. He sat down next to Lloyd George in a seat that his father had occupied when in opposition. Indeed, the same seat on which Lord Randolph had stood waving his handkerchief to cheer the downfall of Gladstone in 1885.
Just a quick reference for those who don't follow the House of Commons. So, traditionally, if you're walking in the chamber, if you're walking in the chamber and you're facing the speaker, and you turn to the right, that's the side of the opposition. If you to the left, that's the side of the government. So the prime minister sits on the left-hand side of the chamber if you're facing from the rear toward the front, and the opposition sits on the right side in the front half. So left and right.
Yep, that's how it works. Next it says, Churchill argued that David Lloyd George was a major influence on his early political life. Quote, naturally, such a man greatly influenced me. When I crossed the floor of the House and left the Conservative Party in 1904, it was by his side I took my seat. It has been argued that Lloyd George became a father figure to Churchill. John Grigg, Lloyd George's biographer, has claimed that Churchill soon fell under Lloyd George's spell, and for the rest of his life never ceased to regard the Welshman as his master. Now, I like this part because we now see who is going to be the influencer in regards to creating the Winston Churchill that we're going to know leading up to World War II. Likewise, I can't wait till we start getting into the political side of Adolf Hitler and see the man that would go on to develop his image. And in my honest opinion, and you definitely would know more about this, Mr. Paul, but the man who really changed the image for Adolf Hitler, I personally believe the man was a work of art. Like the way he transformed Adolf Hitler from a run-of-the-mill, on the streets type of guy who pretty much somewhat hide behind his own shadow to a guy who would have so much oratorial skills and influence. To me, it's amazing once we go back on that path.
Absolutely, totally. Because, Adolf Hitler did not create the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler was himself a creation. Someone found him, took him out of one of the beer halls, polished him up, dressed him up, changed his rhetoric, changed his speech. It was over time that Adolf made his power move, and then he renamed the party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, but he did not create the Nazi Party. He himself was originally a mouthpiece who actually ended up being smarter than the man who created him. But again, that's too much history and goes against the narratives.
Very true. Very true. All right. Next it says, Robert Lloyd George has argued that there were political reasons for this relationship. Quote, Churchill looked up to the older man and sought to his counsel and advice. He wanted to demonstrate his commitment to the Liberal Party by moving towards its more radical wing, which was led by Lloyd George. At this stage, Churchill was still, in many ways, the overgrown schoolboy. A genius, certainly, but impetuous, impressionable, grasping the ideas of liberalism with all the passion of a convert to a new religion, anxious to prove his sincerity and commitment before the older acolytes of the faith. I tell you, it never ceased to amaze me. Especially, I remember back in my college days when I would see some of the students who would get involved in the so-called school politics, especially at the university level. They will get heavily involved in either the Democrats or Republican sides and everything. And a lot of these individuals, they truly believe that they're going to go out there and really make the world something different, something of a better place and everything. And even back then, I didn't know much about politics, American politics that I know now. But even back then, I had to laugh and chuckle at them because I'm saying to myself, here's a young individual who really, has good intentions, good potentials, but they really don't know what they're getting into. And if they don't get out quickly, it's going to ruin them for a whole lifetime.
It's at this point that I'd like to say, at this point right here, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler were in the exact same position and the exact same person. What
Mm-hmm.
you just wrote, what you just read right here, is a carbon copy template of all three men.
Yep.
I find that highly interesting.
Yep. And what I also find interesting too, all three men in the same impressionable stage before they find their identity. And all it takes is one particular man who was ahead of their time to mold their mindset to
Yes.
make them that political figure that we now know about them in the history books. So, like you rightfully pointed out, at this moment in time, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, they could have completely gone in many different directions. But it was at this stage where, as they say, their fates was starting to get sealed.
And it's funny because all three of them did not get along with their fathers. Two of them, their fathers, were physically abusive. They had
Mm-hmm.
emotionally disconnected, dysfunctional childhoods. They all dabbled in the arts and in religion.
Mm-hmm.
They were all failed artists. They were all horrible soldiers in the military. I mean, you can literally just take one and just cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. It's funny how all three, it seems as if all three of them were just destined to fight each other because they are basically the same person, all three. And that's one of the beautiful things that I really love about this series that we do, because for those who are interested and curious to peel back the layers of the history and the public images of all three of these men, they really were the same person, same backgrounds, came from the same places, same things that shaped and molded them along the way. And you can see how two of them were monsters in the making. The third was just an egomaniacal blowhard. And all
Mm-hmm.
three ended up in the same exact position. Amazing. Truly is amazing.
Yeah, and this is just the three figureheads that we're looking at on the side of Europe. We still have one more figurehead in Europe we're going to look at, and then the other world leaders that we're going to later on talk about. Like you said, cut and paste, copy and paste. They may have had, you know, different paths as far as what they did or the people they interact with, but they all of them have had some sort of triggering position, as I would call it, to where if you would swap them out in all their positions, it's not surprising they would most likely still end up with the same type of personalities as the person they switched out with.
It's funny that you say that because I am somewhat well versed on Admiral Yamamoto. I know next to nothing about the Emperor. I know a little bit about General Tojo. So I'm actually looking forward to when we get to the East to learn about the Emperor and the power dynamic between the Emperor and the army. Because I've asked you this question, and I asked Kitagakari Jones, because it seemed to me that as I do some periphery research, I question how much actual power the Emperor had.
Mm-hmm.
That it was almost a case of he felt he had to appease General Tojo and the army. Again, I could be wrong. I am nowhere near as well versed on Imperial Japan as I am the European theater of conflict, and especially Germany. But I have a lot of questions that I look forward to just learning when we hit Japan.
Oh, absolutely. And even myself, you know, I've studied a good portion of the Eastern theater, or excuse me, not Eastern theater, the European theater in regards
Right.
to the war and all. But
Hmm.
even right now, a lot of some of these details that I haven't even heard about, it has changed some of my perspective, especially when reading up on how the childhood of these three men that we just talked about. I never would have guessed that all three of them literally had cut and paste sort of upbringings
Hmm.
with slight degrees of differences, but yet all three would exhibit some sort of egotistical tyrant type of personality that will literally they will be given the reins to control an entire nation. Like I never would have thought they had that much similarity.
It's funny you say that because all three of them were failed soldiers. So Adolf Hitler did not listen to Admiral Rader and to Field Marshal Rommel. Had he
Mm-hmm.
listened to those two men, almost every military historian will tell you Germany should have won the war. Not would have, they should have won the war. Had he listened to
Mm-hmm.
just those two men. But that whole failed history, you can see as we, did a deep dive into his background to why he would listen to an unproven, unskilled person like Hermann Goering over proven battle commanders such as Erwin Rommel and Admiral Rader.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely. So next it says Lloyd George's devoted secretary and mistress, Frances Stevenson, provides an interesting insight into the relationship. Quote, the plain fact was he, Lloyd George, had not much time for friendship. There was an aloof and withdrawn quality, an essential secretiveness which forbade access to any abiding intimacy. In his relations with Churchill, there was a difference. From the earliest political days, these two were strangely and prophetically drawn together. Each divined in the other the quality of genius which separated them from the ordinary run of men and drew them together, the village boy and the Duke's grandson. Violet Bonham Carter argued that, quote, Lloyd George and Churchill had the closest and in some ways the most incongruous alliance. The most curious and surprising feature of their partnership was that while it exercised no influence whatsoever on Lloyd George, politically or otherwise, it directed, shaped, and colored Winston Churchill's mental attitude and his political course during the next few years. Lloyd George was throughout the dominant partner. His was the only personal leadership I have ever known Winston to accept unquestionably in his whole political career. He was fascinated by a mind more swift and agile than his own, by its fertility and resource, by its uncanny intuition and gymnastic nimbleness, and by a political sophistication which he lacked. A few days after he left the Conservative Party, he admitted to a close friend he might have made a mistake, as Arthur Balfour seemed to be turning against the idea of tariff reform. Quote, as the free trade issue subsides, it leaves my personal ambitions naked and stranded on the beach. Michael Hicks' speech warned Churchill that, quote, radical tendencies in Tory, or Tory tendencies in a radical, however agreeable to the conscience, handicap a man severely on the run. As the historian John Charmley has pointed out, quote, there is no room in politics for an independent conservative. Every political party values loyalty above independence of judgment, but only the conservatives regard it as the Ark of the Covenant.
You have to repeat that. That is such a deep statement.
I will gladly read that again. As the historian John Charmley has pointed out, quote, there is no room in politics for an independent conservative. Every political party values loyalty above independence of judgment, but only the conservatives regard it as the Ark of the Covenant. Funny how that plays in well into American politics.
Not only American politics, but politics around the world. Politics
Oh,
and
yes.
statecraft are two different things. He's literally telling you publicly, the public face is party above all else.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that all the time. All politicians, they toe the line, toe the line, toe the line. It doesn't matter what. It doesn't matter how beneficial it is. You have to toe the party line. That's, again, another common phrase in the modern day lexicon. Toe the party line. You see where it comes from. When a person tells you who they are, believe them. But the masses continually choose. They refuse to accept the truths. And I said it before, and I'll say it again. You have no say in your government at the highest levels. Your government will literally kill you to maintain power. People will kill you before they accept those truths.
Yep. And, oh my goodness. This is why I will ask anybody, why is it that, at least here in America, with other political parties around the world, you can definitely see a system where there's more than two political parties. But for some reason, here in America, there's only two. You're either a Democrat or you're a Republican. Nowhere in between and nowhere outside of those two. And that quote that I just repeated pretty much highlights, yes, both parties value loyalty, but conservatives, especially for those out there that like to talk about conservatism and everything, they hold that up to, I mean, if there was such thing as a political 10 commandments, that would be it for the conservative party. And it's amazing it truly is amazing how far people will defend a political party even if the policies they put in place is detrimental to those individuals.
Well, the thing is this, right? When you have a two-party system, one party has consistently proven it does not need you for anything. The entire world knows you will unwaveringly. People get emotionally triggered when I use the word blindly. So when you unwaveringly support the other party, where exactly is your political power?
Uh-oh. That's going down the rabbit hole.
We're going to leave that right there. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But for those who are listening in, please take into account your loyalty does not guarantee your freedom. But I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna leave it there.
Oh, you dug down deep for that statement. I haven't heard that one in a long time. That's an old one. I love that one too.
Oh boy, I can't wait till we really start getting into a lot of these nations' politics. We're seeing a little bit briefly as in regards to Russia's and now England's, but when we really delve into the politics that were going on leading up to the first battle of World War II, it's just hilarious as far as the loyalty of the people back then and even now, even though it's just like your loyalty does not guarantee you your freedom. But people just, I was about to say blindly, but I caught myself. People just unforgivingly.
Yes, unforgivingly, unwaveringly. When you say blindly, people, they get emotionally triggered and they want to attack you. So it's more palatable when you say unwaveringly, or overwhelmingly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the truth hurts, so you can't say blindly.
That is true. That's definitely a quote I will definitely have to tell some people I know. Your loyalty does not guarantee your freedom. But we're going to move on. Winston Churchill was now selected to stand for the Liberal Party in northwest Manchester. Under pressure from the British Brothers League, the Conservative government introduced an Alien Act, in an attempt to reduce immigration to Britain. Balfour claimed that the measure would save money for the country. Quote, "Why should we admit into this country people likely to become a public charge?" Many countries which exclude immigrants have no poor laws. They have not those great charities of which we justly boast. The immigrant comes in at his own peril and perishes if he cannot find a living. That is not the case here. From the famous statue of Elizabeth, we have taken on ourselves the obligation of supporting every man, woman, and child in this country and saving them from starvation. Is the Statute of Elizabeth to have European extension? Are we to be bound to support every man, woman, and child incapable of supporting themselves who choose to come to our shores? That argument seems to me to be preposterous when it is remembered that some of these persons are a most undesirable element in the population and are not likely to produce healthy children. but are afflicted with disease, either of mind or of body, which makes them intrinsically undesirable citizens. Surely, the fact that they are likely to become a public charge is a double reason to keeping them out of the country.
Now, the British Commonwealth, no, I'm sorry, the British colonies didn't become the British Commonwealth until after the war when England could no longer sustain their colonies. So, the British colonies were the countries that were still under British control on the continent of Africa, India, and whatever Asian interests the crown still had. Those are the people that he's referencing for anyone who does not know. So look up British colonies circa 1900 to 1910. The entirety of the West Indies. Several nations throughout Africa, India, and a few other Asian interests. Let that sink in.
Yep. And what I find interesting is when he made mention in that one of the last few sentences where he says, when it is remembered that some of these persons are most undesirable element in the population and are not likely to produce the healthy children, but are afflicted with disease either of mind or body, which makes them intrinsically undesirable citizens. I want audience to understand. Even back then, and even now, there are certain aspects of the population that, you know what, I'll say it like this. For those who were watching the 2016 election and they caught where President Trump says, I love dealing with the poor and uneducated. What? I'm trying to say this in a more polite way without really trying to pin out people, but I just may have to come out and say it. There will always be individuals who, unfortunately, their mindset will spread on to their children. And especially if they produce these children in mass, those children will then become part of a community where instead of being a benefit to society, they really become a hindrance. And it does not mean these particular people immigrated to a country. It can also be from within. But I'm going to leave it there. Because if I kind of hint at where I'm going, people are afraid of change. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, you know, I'll say this. As we both said at the very top, those who do not learn the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat them. And as you said, there is nothing new under the sun, and nothing you're seeing in 2020 is unprecedented. None of it. So whether you're calling people undesirables who will be a public charge, or you're using any other terms, bad hombres or shithole countries, whatever terms you want to use, It's all the same thing. However, you have to understand something. And here's where I'm going with this. And I try to have this conversation with people, but it's extremely difficult. You have to understand the difference between politics and statecraft. Politicians say things publicly for effect. It's all public theater.
Mm-hmm.
What they tell you in public and how they feel behind closed doors are two very different things. Now, sometimes it is true. Granted, history is replete with those examples. However, do not take the things a politician tells you at face value and assign weight to them. It's all public theater. Because they can say one thing one day, and when tides shift, they're saying something else entirely different down the road. So it begs the question, did you really feel that way always? Or are you just now going whichever way the wind blows? Again, many questions to ask. It just goes to show, people do not understand what politics is. It's all BS. It's a smokescreen.
Yeah, but unfortunately, people follow politics like they follow religion, and those are just two subjects. I'm just baffled how people will give up their own identity in the name of being part of something, as they say, is bigger than them. But in actuality, it's just complete smoke and mirrors. But I digress. Next paragraph it says, although the word Jew was absent from the legislation, Jews formed the vast bulk of the aliens category. Speaking during the committee stage of the Alien Bill, Balfour argued that Jews should be prevented from arriving in Britain because they were not, quote, to the advantage of the civilization of this country, that there should be an immense body of persons who, however patriotic, able, and industrious, however much they throw themselves into the national life, they are a people apart, and not only had a religion differing from the vast majority of their fellow countrymen, but only intermarry amongst themselves. The Liberal Party did not strongly oppose this proposed measure, but Churchill was aware of the significant number of Jews in his constituency. He did not oppose the legislation on moral grounds, but that it would be ineffective. Quote, by the admission of the House Secretary, the following case might occur. A ship with 300 immigrants on board arrived at a scheduled port. 285 passed the various tests and were allowed to land and go forward as transmigrant, while the 15 who were rejected simply went on to another port in another ship in possession of the same line of steamers and got in there. He submitted to the House Secretary that the machinery he was setting up would result in the residue of immigrants rejected by any one of his specified ports going on to other ports not scheduled and landing there with perfect impunity. So, I find it interesting that for those who remember our episode when we were talking about Adolf Hitler, right towards the end of World War I, when the Germans just out of nowhere surrendered to the war, it was then when Adolf Hitler started to question the influence of the Jews in regards to the German life and in regards to how they may does some things behind the scenes that was detrimental to the country. What I find interesting, here you have Winston Churchill in regards to creating an alien bill and his language in regard to allowing the Jews to come into the country and whether they are effective or not. You could just look at his reasoning and kind of see that him and Hitler kind of share similar ideals when it comes down to that particular group of people.
Are we peeling back the layers of the carefully crafted image of Winston Churchill as one of the greatest men of the 20th century? With his own words?
Yeah, because like I said, I just find it interesting how we just read up about Adolf Hitler and his views on the Jews after World War One. Here we have a gentleman from a totally different background, a well-to-do background at that, yet his wording would make it seem like he too shares similar thoughts and patterns like Mr. Hitler.
Exactly. So this is another one of the things that I've been waiting to come up. And I'm glad it's finally come up. Winston Churchill's image as a humanitarian, as a great man, a man of the people, it's all lies. It's BS. Winston Churchill put down several quote-unquote uprisings or rebellions in India.
Mm-hmm.
He hated India. He hated Indians. Couldn't stand Gandhi. Thought even less of a certain demographic. But I don't feel a way about that. But it is what it is. To see members of that demographic hail Mahatma Gandhi, who, by the way, Gandhi did not like that certain demographic also. But I digress since we're not covering him. So my point here is, it's funny how we're seeing the same views and outlook espoused by Adolf Hitler being espoused by Winston Churchill. So once you peel back the layers, it begs several questions, which I'm sure we're going to get to. So I will pass the mic back to you.
Absolutely, but definitely that was just something that even when I read it beforehand, it was like the thought process just came back to me. It's like, well, wait a minute. His way of thinking on this subject is literally no different than how Hitler was thinking the same thing right after World War One, especially once the Germans lost that war. And so I'm thinking to myself, wow, even though history has these two individuals pitting against each other in the future events to come, even from their own different backgrounds in life up to that point, it was just scary how on this particular subject they share similar thought process and ideas. And I'm going to just leave it there. But it's just something for the audience to take into consideration. The words that I just read to you were that of Winston Churchill. If I was to tell you that Adolf Hitler shared the same sentiments, even you would have to question what is going on. All right, so we're almost finished up. It says Arthur Balfour now began to have second thoughts on this policy of free trade and warned Joseph Chamberlain about the impact on the electorate in the next general election. Quote, the prejudice against a small tax on food is not the fad of a few imperfectly informed theorists. It is a deep-rooted prejudice affecting a large mass of voters, especially the poorest class, which it will be a matter of extreme difficulty to overcome. Asquith made speeches that attempted to frighten the growing working class electorate, quote, to whom cheap food had been a much cherished boon for the last quarter of a century, and it annoyed the middle class who saw the prospect of a reduction in the purchasing power of their fixed incomes. As well as splitting the Conservative Party, it united, quote, the liberals who had been hitherto hopelessly divided on all the main political issues. David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill were now seen as the leaders of the left wing of the Liberal Party. In one cartoon entitled Too Old at 60 by George Rowland Halkett that was published in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1905, showed Lord George and Churchill as two young firebrands, ready to move on, old diehards like Henry Campbell Bannerman, John Morley, John Burns, Henry Fowler, and Victor Bruce. And this is actually the picture that it's talking about in the last paragraph. Next, finishing up, it says in 1905, Winston Churchill concentrated on writing his father's biography. Churchill wrote to most of Lord Randolph's former colleagues in the Conservative Party and asked them to help with the book. Most of them refused, as they were still angry by his recent defection to the Liberals. Quote, Churchill chose to represent his father's career as a Greek tragedy. He portrays his father not as a man of ambition, but as a man of principle who invented, quote, Tory democracy in the early 1880s. Lord Randolph's resignation is seen as a supreme act of self-sacrifice undertaken for the cause of public economy, and as a result of deep political differences between Lord Randolph and Lord Salisbury, rather than personal incompatibility or clashing ambitions. John Charmley has argued convincingly that the book, Lord Randolph Churchill, quote, established its author's reputation as a historian, but that was only half his work. The other half was to establish the suitability of its hero as a role model for his son. Lord Randolph is presented as the true heir of Benjamin Disraeli, who had been destroyed by the reactionaries in the Tory party. Wilfred Scawen Blount wrote in his diary that Churchill was, quote, playing precisely his father's game, and was now looking to, quote, to a leadership of the Liberal Party and an opportunity of full vengeance on those who caused his father's death.
Bingo.
I just find it funny when you look at these three characters and how they at first made it their business that they did not want to become like their fathers, but yet and still their fathers had some small influence to where all of a sudden they're literally following their father's footsteps. You just can't make this up.
You really can't. You really can't. It is an amazing. You just can't make this stuff, man. I mean, three men, practically the same exact background, practically the same upbringing, except that one was born with a silver spoon in their mouth, other two were both poor, but basically the same mental and emotional circumstances, practically the same path throughout life, from school to military, possible seminary, possible artistic school. Every step of the way, they walked the same path. It's like these three men, it's like there was nothing that they could have done to prevent. I can't, I can't get over the fact that each of these men eventually became the leader of their respective nation and fought each
Mm-hmm.
other in a war, given their backgrounds. I mean, had you asked any person in either in the military, the seminary, or in government that any of these men would actually become the leader of the nation and lead the nation to war, I guarantee you, to a man, everyone would have said, who, that clown? Never in a million years.
Yes. I'm just baffled at the moment because we see so far in this series we have seen three men who, despite their upbringing and despite the differences to degrees of how they were brought up, literally it's almost as if somebody had foresaw their future and said these men are going to grow up where they would they would literally seek out the love from their fathers in some form or fashion. And when
Mm.
seeking out the love from their fathers, will go on to literally run a nation into war.
You know, is that is a very insightful question. That really is a very insightful point. Because all three of them had daddy issues very clearly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Problems with authority, all three.
Mm-hmm.
Did very poorly in the military, had poor fitness ratings.
Mm-hmm.
Were all rated as being poor officers, did not foster teamwork, had a lack of respect for authority and the military chain of command, the inability to lead men.
Mm-hmm. And even when starting out in the political realm, all three were seen as lunatics.
Yeah. Yes, anti-establishment, against the party, not towing the party line, wanted to be were seen as radical because they were rational thinkers, or at least at least presented the image of being a rational thinker.
Yeah. Yeah.
You bring up a very good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, it's just something where, just reflecting on the past episodes leading up to now, looking at these three characters, prominent characters at that, they're on completely different sides of, in this case, the English Channel. And they all are going about things differently. However, at is almost like at each intricate part in their life, we can literally pinpoint all three of these men literally have lacked some sort of guidance, male guidance at that. And they set about their ways to go about getting that sort of guidance. Now, how they go about it, that depends on whose story you read or whose background you read. But it's just funny how no matter which background you read, they all literally end up in the same pre-World War II position, and that is controlling a mass nation of people.
Yeah, I. It's astounding. It really is. It really is. It just when you look at it, I mean, who would have thought that these three men, given their backgrounds and who they were, but I will say this to some degree. I would ask. I'm just thinking. I'm just
Hmm.
thinking. In this day and age, would a person from that background um, make it to that same position? And I say that understanding that the then is not now, because then a person, it was wide open that absolutely could have happened. In this day and age now, the wealthy elite have everything on total and complete lockdown. So for a person to be in that position, they're put there.
Hmm.
But all the things being equal, um, I don't know. For lack of a better term, it was a different world. It was a different time.
Yeah,
I doubt we'll ever really know.
that's true. That's true. Although I did hear from reading up a little bit on his background, Mr. President Donald J. Trump, he too did not have a good relations with his father. So that had me thinking a bit too. Yeah.
Yeah, but see, the thing there is, again, every U.S. president since LBJ has been a puppet. Everyone,
Oh yeah.
John F. Kennedy is the last American president who was not a puppet, and he
Mm-hmm.
he did not go along with the program. They put a bullet in his brain,
Mm-hmm.
and LBJ, his vice president, took his place. Within weeks, full-scale assault troops in Vietnam, and the CIA goes from being on the chopping block to what we know it is now. Alan Dulles was
Mm-hmm.
not rehired or replaced as was not brought back as director of the CIA, but the CIA came off the chopping block because President Kennedy was going to. He was waiting till after the election, but he was going to shut down the CIA and
Mm-hmm.
folds everything into the FBI and have the FBI do it. He fired Alan Dulles as the director of the CIA after the Bay of Pigs invasion failure, and he felt that the CIA was too big, it was too powerful. They didn't really answer to him or to anyone else, so he wanted to get rid of them. And he was dead set against Vietnam, even though all of his generals were pushing for it. Were pushing for it. And President Eisenhower coined the phrase about the military-industrial complex. Well, they had the last laugh. When I say they, the wealthy controlling elite. So every president, including Barack Hussein Obama, including William Jefferson Clinton, including Donald J. Trump, they're all puppets. Every single last one.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I just there's so much evidence out there if you connect the dots. It's not conspiracy. It's not tinfoil hat. It's the nature of the world that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the greatest asset of a person who was in control behind the scenes is convincing the world that there is no one behind the scenes. It's the man. It's the man behind the curtain.
Yep. And sadly, I would say 99% of the entire population fall for it every single time, hook, line, and sinker, without a doubt. So, with that being stated, and that concludes this episode of the War Room, and actually concludes this part in regards to Winston Churchill. He will not be come up again until later on when we dive deeper into the British politics leading up and everything. But so far, good sir, what is your opinion on the development so far of Winston Churchill?
I said it before and I'll say it again. He was no great man. He was a POS. He was no great man. By no means. But he had the gift of gab. He had charisma. And that's all it takes. That's all it takes to get the masses behind you. Because the masses are sheep. That's why they're called sheep. That's why they're called the masses. They are sheep. So the illusion is all about keeping the masses happy. And he played up to that illusion. He understood that. He recognized that. And that's what he did. You know, you see so many people in their own writings. He wasn't that smart. He wasn't that brilliant. And, there's one thing that I'm really going to wait until we cover it, was his time as first Sea Lord. Again, how do you put a failed soldier as the commander-in-chief of the Royal Navy?
Power of illusion.
Yes.
That should be the word of the night. The power of illusion. If you want to summarize politics and how politics remain one of the most talked about and influential sectors in today's world, is all summarized by it being power of illusion. That's why it still continues on to this day.
And it's funny because, again, at the highest levels, you have no voice in your government. Your government will literally kill you to maintain power. People do not want to understand or accept those two simple truths. People will literally kill you before they accept those truths. It's all an illusion. It's all a game. No matter what the name, we're all the same. Pieces in one big chess game.
Yep. And depending on where you are on that chessboard, I'm just speaking for Sigma Jones, but sir, I'm pretty sure you feel the same way. I'd rather build up my skills to where I can now be the king on the chessboard rather than the pawn. But you have a lot of folks who are, all intent purposes, content with being just the pawn.
Someone said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly, yet expecting a different result. I would add to that. If you have been unsuccessful in what you are doing, and people have been doing it for decades, you would have to be an abject fool to not wake up and think, maybe the issue is me. Maybe I need to look at what I'm doing and adjust accordingly. Maybe my perspective has been wrong. But that requires introspection. And introspection is the most painful thing in the human condition. People don't want to do it. It's always easy to point that finger everywhere except where it belongs, in the mirror. That is why religion is so powerful. It's not about whether the stories are true or not. It's population control through fear. Politics, it's population control through hope. Either way.
Oh, yes.
Controlling of the mindset. What is the first of the 7 Hermetic principles? The law of mentalism. All is mental because mental is supreme. You do not need whips and chains if you control a man's mind.
Yep.
And rather than accept that everything you accept as the nature of your reality is false, person will literally kill you rather than ever accept that.
That is true. That is true. Well, as always, I'd like to thank the audience for tuning in to this episode of The War Room. We will definitely be sending out our next subject of The War Room on next month. And believe me, you're definitely want to tune into the next episode, as we're going to be talking about another European leader who you'll probably say the patterns keep repeating itself. Oh, it's going to be painfully obvious with this next particular person. But
I really want to say his nickname, but I won't. I'll leave it alone.
well, as you can see, my co-host Logic Finance, he already knows who we're going to be talking about, and believe me, you're definitely going to enjoy the next episode on this person we're going to talk about. But with that said, I am Sigma Jones. This is my co-host Logic Finance. Thank you for tuning in to the War Room. Until next time.